Hello, and welcome to our weekly live stream dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. It's March 23rd, 2023. I'm Harley Schlanger, and I will be your host. Before we get to Helga, let me remind you that you can join in the discussion by sending your questions or comments to questions@schillerinstitute.org or posting them in the chat section, and Anastasia will forward them to us. Well, Helga, it's been another week chock full of significant events on the strategic diplomatic front and on the economic financial front. Let's begin with your assessment of where things stand now.
Well, I think it is today the third day of the visit of President Xi Jinping in Moscow. And I would like to comment on that because, the Western media has been, at least in Germany, some media have been absolutely ridiculous in characterizing this meeting. Now, from the standpoint of the bilateral relation between Russia and China, I think this was a very productive, very successful meeting. They concluded, they agreed on two major documents with many points of agreement, increase trade and investment, and having all kinds of security cooperation agreements. So I think that from the standpoint of strengthening the economic relation between Russia and China, it is very fruitful. Many projects were discussed, various transport corridors, the long-term gas and oil pipeline. So I think that if you only look at it from the bilateral standpoint, it was very productive. Now, this was played up high because China has also made in February already a 12-point proposal for a peace settlement in Ukraine. And this was categorically rejected by the US, by the EU Commission, by all kinds of other people making, demands which from the beginning would mean that no settlement can take place. But I think the West should better listen to the Chinese proposal if this horrible war should come to an end. I mean, the situation in Ukraine is getting really desperate. Many casualties on both sides. There is talk about a spring offensive, maybe from Russia, maybe a counteroffensive from Ukraine. In any case, this does still have very much the potential of an escalation into a larger war, which worries many people around the world. So the Chinese proposal, which is really the most advanced proposal on the table so far, should be listened to. And it's not impossible because, even if the situation in Ukraine is what it is in terms of influence of the United States and NATO and Britain and so forth, nevertheless, China also has a strategic partnership with Ukraine, not just with Russia. And President Zelensky has expressed interest to have a phone discussion with President Xi Jinping, which in all likelihood will now take place once the visit is ended. Now, this is very important because, if there is any hope to get quickly to an end, it is really following the Chinese proposal. And I think it's very important to understand that China and Russia are not identical. I mean, they have a strategic partnership. They have moved closer together, among other things, thanks to the sanctions against Russia. But the relationship between between Russia and China is a long one. It goes, way back, and especially since President Xi Jinping is in office since 10 years, he and Putin have met 40 times. 8 times Xi Jinping traveled to Russia. So this is not about Ukraine as such. And China it's very important that the West understands exactly what China's intention is. China has more interest in peace than anything else. China has not allowed itself to be drawn into the conflict China is making a very strong and powerful move to reintegrate Russia into the international security community, and find a solution to the crisis. But China is trying to move the whole world to a new paradigm, to a higher level of diplomacy. It's open to economic cooperation. The Belt and Road Initiative is still open for any country which wishes to cooperate. So I think that this is a very important thing. Now, China has just proven that it is capable of bridging seemingly impossible conflicts, like recently, because of the mediation by China, Wang Yi in particular, it was possible to get an agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Now, President Raisi from Iran is now invited to Saudi Arabia on a, quote, brotherly visit. That's a huge breakthrough. And in the aftermath of that agreement, all kinds of things are falling into place. President Assad of Syria was in Moscow. Then after that, he traveled to the United Arab Emirates. The relationship between Syria and the other Arab countries is getting better. Saudi Arabia and Yemen started to exchange prisoners. Between Iran and Iraq, there has been now made an agreement to settle border difficulties. So one can see that once you put the direction on diplomacy and solutions and conflict solutions through negotiations, everything is possible. So I think that sort of momentum coming from this really historic change in the Middle East or Southwest Asia, that momentum could carry over into the Ukraine. One has to see, obviously in the West, including NATO, there are still people who absolutely continue to say Ukraine must win. Now, Ukraine will never win because Russia will never lose. You will never get a nuclear power, in particular the strongest nuclear power on the planet, to give up and, capitulate. Rather we will have World War III, and then for sure nobody wins. And I think that is something which has not yet registered in the heads of some Western leaders. So I can only say it would be the wisest thing to quickly pick up on the Chinese proposal and then move on, because we have some other problems, the least of which is the not finished financial crisis. I mean, we just barely, avoided another chain reaction collapse by, the Federal Reserve moving in on the Silicon Valley Bank and some other American banks. And then tremendous pressure was exerted on the Swiss bank, UBS, Union Banks of Switzerland, to basically take over Credit Suisse. Now, Credit Suisse first was attempted to be bailed out with $54 billion. That proved to be not enough. And then, because of the systemic risk, pressure was asserted, I would assume, on Switzerland to force UBS to take over Credit Suisse. Now, what is the effect of that? Now, Switzerland has one mega super monster bank, too big to fail. And, what happens if that bank fails? The entire Swiss economy would be massively affected. I mean, this is a gamble with the livelihood of the Swiss people and the Swiss economy, which I think is extremely risky. And now there were interviews today by various experts from this, Lausanne University, by basically saying that nobody knows what the exposure of Credit Suisse was in respect to derivatives and swaps, and that because of the rapidity with which all of this happened, Union Bank of Switzerland did not have time to make a proper investigation of what they were forced to take over. So they had basically bought the cat in the bag. Now, that can have some very unpleasant surprises in the short term. So we are not out of the danger zone, and nothing has been resolved fundamentally in the financial system in the West. And therefore, I think, the quicker people come to the understanding that a continuation of this geopolitical confrontation can only lead to the demise of all of us, and the more quickly we come to the agreement that the entire world system needs a fundamental overhaul, which we have been calling for in the form of a new security and development architecture, which I still insist must be put on the table, which takes into account the interest of every single country on the planet. So I think that these are the most pressing issues, and I think the relationship between Russia and China should not be regarded as a threat to the West, because it is not that. It's explicitly not that. And if you have a continuation whereby the West is forcing every country to take side, to be part of the quote democracies in an alliance against the so-called autocracies, now that would be very damaging and lead to World War III sooner or later, because a bloc formation whereby you have the United States, Great Britain, the EU, and then maybe Japan and one or two other countries in the Indo-Pacific building one bloc, and then the BRICS plus, which is by now BRICS plus 24 countries who have applied for membership, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization countries, the Eurasian Economic Union countries, and most of the African Union, ASEAN, and the countries of the Global South, who by a large margin represent the majority of the human race. If these two blocs would be in a confrontational position against each other, it can only be to the detriment of humanity as a whole. So the sooner reasonable people and reasonable forces in the West agree that they should change their attitude and start to send out signals that they are willing to cooperate, the better. So this is really what I wanted to say in the beginning, and I didn't want to make a too long speech, because we have, I understand, a lot of questions, and I wanted to give you the opportunity to ask as many of them as possible.
Well, we do have a lot of questions. There's a lot of people want to know what you think about these things, and they also want some guidance on what they can do to make these changes that you're talking about. So if you do have questions, send them to questions@schillerinstitute.org, and we'll see if we can get to them. Let me start with one on the war situation, on the China-Russia negotiations. This is from an Ohio radio talk show host who asked, what is the likelihood that the US or NATO governments will respond positively to President Xi's peace plan? Is there any way to put enough pressure on these governments, since they've already said they're not going to? Is there any way to pressure them to change so they'll accept President Xi's proposal?
Yes, I think what we need is a real mass mobilization, because, it is very clear that many people are concerned about the war danger. That has expressed itself in the very large demonstration on February 19th in Washington, a subsequent demonstration beginning of March, also in Washington, a big demonstration in Berlin beginning of March. And naturally, if you look at Europe, there is a total disarray. France, in the aftermath of the dictatorial decision by Macron to implement the pension reform, violence in the streets. Great Britain in a practically endless strike wave. Strikes will erupt in Germany in the short term. Italy is in turmoil. I think if all of these movements, even if they have a specific cause, like, pensions or wages or whatever, would also demand peace. Because I think, it's not enough to be against the war at this point, but we have to have a growing number of people who demand solutions, and the solutions has to be, a cooperation in a new security and development architecture, a solution to the pending financial disintegration of the transatlantic financial system, We have, campaigned for that for a long time. The 4 laws of LaRouche are absolutely the way to go. The first step of which is a global Glass-Steagall banking separation. And, that is back on the table. In Switzerland, a lot of people have now, several parliamentarians and others are now demanding the reintroduction of Glass-Steagall. In the United States, Maria Cantwell asked for it, Marcy Kaptur and others. This is just the beginning. But, that in all of these cases, the idea that the West must respond to the peace plan of China for Ukraine should be added. And people should think, first of all, we have many forms of, maybe we should write a new resolution with especially that. I will discuss that with my colleagues today. I think that if people would, make statements, you have social media, you have ways of participating in all kinds of discussions. You can write letters to the editor. You can have resolutions. I think what we need is a lot of ferment because, if the war escalates, we all could be dead very quickly. But if there is a pressure where people say, look, this terrible killing and dying in Ukraine has to stop, the first priority is a ceasefire. We have to find a solution through negotiations. That must be the first priority. And, there is a realistic proposal on the table by China. And the more people are giving support to that, the more we have the chance. And governments have to consider, if they continuously make a policy which goes against the will of the majority of their population, they may be out of office sometime soon because, governments in so-called democracies are not put there by God forever, but the voters have a right to express their will. And the more powerfully this is done in the short term, the better.
And Helga, I'd also like to mention that people should look at your 10 fundamental principles, which somewhat are parallel to what the Chinese have proposed. That's available at the schillerinstitute.com website. Now, there are a couple of other questions on the war threat and China, but there's one from Stuart who writes that he thinks the only way to stop war is to stop companies from making profits in arms production and trade. He said politicians are bribed with funds from the manufacturers and the people have no say. He asked, what do you think? Is this a viable action?
Yes, but you need lawmakers who make laws who curb the power and influence of these military-industrial complex firms. I think it's a correct idea because, from the standpoint of physical economy, the entire production of military equipment is a complete waste. I mean, if you think how much of real wealth in terms of raw materials, labor power, physical production is wasted by, producing all of these different weapon systems. If you would redirect all of this production into civilian production, factories, machine tool, building transport lines, building, industrial complexes, beefing up the agriculture to double the food production, because we have still a gigantic starvation in the world of almost 2 billion people. I mean, I really think that the question is, to retool the military-industrial complex will be a question we will not get around. I know that this is right now the biggest, obstacle because Wall Street, the City of London, and, unfortunately, some other places, which are also weapon producers. I mean, they're all intertwined. What Ray McGovern correctly calls the Mickey Met, the military, industrial, intelligence, Congress, media, academia, military-industrial complex. All of that hangs together. And, the interest of the banking system and the interest of the war machine are identical. Now, obviously, this financial system is bankrupt, and we have argued since a very long time that the real dynamic behind the war danger is the pending threatening collapse of the financial system, and, vice versa, the rise of China, which is only from that standpoint a danger to the world. So therefore, if you want to have a solution, we have to change this entire system. And, for example, if you look at the United States is not in good shape. And frankly, you don't need China to cause the demise of the West. If you allow drug legalization, if you increase the suicide rate by people who have depression, young people who commit suicide, who don't see a hope for the future, or who are so depending on dope that they, don't have a real mind anymore. I mean, the United States is not investing in infrastructure. They're not investing in their future generations. So why is there not a movement in the United States other than the LaRouche movement? I mean, more people joining the LaRouche movement, demanding that the United States could, go back to an American system of economics. I mean, China has 40,000 kilometers. That's more than 30,000 miles of fast train system. These trains go 350 kilometers per hour. That's about 270 miles per hour. They fly through the landscape. They are smooth and clean. They are now working on a 600 kilometer per hour maglev train. The United States has zero. There is not one track. There is a tiny track somewhere between New York and Boston where the train goes for about 1 hour, 120 kilometers, which is ridiculous. So why is the United States not saying, that to connect the West Coast with the East Coast, the northern area with the South, through a system of fast trains, build some new cities. President Trump has said, or former President Trump has said, that he wants build some new cities. Well, then build a fast train system with it. Revamp the entire military-industrial complex to rebuild the American economy. And I think, that would be welcomed by the whole world, and it would do the American people some good. So, but you need a movement of people who pick up on these proposals, which we have proposed since actually the first such plan we presented, not the first one, but the recent one we presented in 2014. So that is my suggestion.
Now, Helga, there's a question related to that, somewhat redundant, but you can pick it up as you wish. It's from Lex, who is asking about overcoming the effects of poverty. And he said, no one should starve in the world today. He said, we have similar problems with access to energy, housing, and so on. He said, how do we make sure that no one will starve in today's world?
Well, it would be very easy to do because, right now the farmers in Europe, for example, in Holland, in Germany and other countries are in the streets because they fear that, the present laws of the EU are designed to cut the agricultural production by 2/3. 2/3 of the farmers fear to go bankrupt. By the same token, you could make legislation to double the food production. You could, basically say we have a starvation crisis and, we need to double the food production. We have to have a plan where we both build up the agriculture in the developing countries, but at the same time, increase the production in those places where you have a developed agriculture in the United States and in Europe. And you can make legislation to make that possible by giving credit, cheap credit, long-term credit to the farmers to do exactly that. You can make legislation to guarantee the access to seed and other farm material So it's really a political will. Now, I think at this point, the only people who really understand that are the farmers. They also understand that the food supply in the present situation is extremely precarious. But what we need is, that other people than farmers join with the farmers, scientists, trade unionists, entrepreneurs. We have to get away from the situation where everybody only thinks about their own interest, because right now we are sitting more in one boat than people can imagine. So to take care of poverty would be very simple. We have developed already in 2014 a plan which we called the New Silk Road Becomes the World Land Bridge, which we published, and you can get it you can go to our website and you can actually acquire it. This is a blueprint. Every industrial development always starts with basic infrastructure. You need a combination of preferably fast trains, waterways, highways. Then you need energy production and distribution. You need to increase the environment for entrepreneurs to invest. That's why we have developed this conception of development corridors, where, according to certain geographical preconditions, you make development corridors where you integrate waterways, railways, highways as a, venue for industrial production. So that can be done in Africa, it can be done in Latin America, Asia. Actually, the Belt and Road Initiative is following such plans. And, all you have to do is get an international cooperation. If there would be a political will, let's say you have an international conference on the new development and security architecture, and you would have an agreement among most governments to go in this direction. And they would start revamping the financial system towards production, not towards speculation. They would give cheap credit. They would basically give credit only for directed purposes, concrete development projects. You could start to eliminate poverty. I don't want to now make too many guesses, but in a year you could have eliminated world hunger. In 5 years you could have a flourishing economy where the most serious poverty would be alleviated. Maybe 10 years you could eliminate the worst poverty, and you could really get in the idea where you build economies for human beings to live. You need a global health system. That means a modern health system in every single country. A country which doesn't have a functioning national health system is not equipped to deal with pandemics or other diseases. So all of this it's not a mystery. We have written a program how to create 1.5 billion new productive jobs. We have written the World Land Bridge Report. We have written concrete development plans for Africa, for Latin America, for Asia, for Europe, for the United States. So, to restart the economy in a serious way by ending the casino economy, it would be a piece of cake if the political will would be there.
Okay, now here's a question, Helga, I think that a number of people have. And by the way, you're listening to Helga Zepp-LaRouche. This is our weekly live stream dialogue. And if you want to get in on the questions, you can send them to Schiller Institute, questions@schillerinstitute.org. Now, here's a question for you on what are your thoughts on the International Criminal Court indictment of Russian President Putin and the possibly pending indictment of former President Trump? Do you see any relationship between the two?
Yes, I think that it's basically the same apparatus. To put President Putin to accuse him or to want an arrest warrant. I mean, it's really chutzpah, I would say, because who is this ICC? Have they received a reputation of honoring justice? Well, I mean, they have a reputation that so far they only went after, leaders in Africa and naturally from former Yugoslavia. But what about the people who did the war against Iraq based on lies? What about Afghanistan? What about Syria? What about Libya? I mean, we have now the 20th anniversary of the war in Iraq, and many very interesting people have written things about it, which I can only advise you to read. Such people as Scott Ritter, Ray McGovern, Joe Loria, and several others. And I can only advise you, go to the Schiller Institute website or EIR-LaRouchePub.com website and read the speeches which were made at a conference of the Schiller Institute in the very day the Iraq war started in 2003. This was in Germany, in Bad Schwalbach, and my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, gave an extremely powerful speech. I made a speech where, because we were so shocked, because we knew that there was no weapons of mass destruction. It was commonly known among anybody who was interested in it. And I said, these people are idiots, because if they think that the nemesis will not come down on them, referring to the Cranes of Ibycus, this famous poem by the poet Friedrich Schiller. And I said, look, why is the ICC not going after the people who are committing this? Nancy Pelosi and the ICC, they did not pursue Bush and Cheney and Biden, for that matter, who was very much involved in the decision-making for that war. Now, Nancy Pelosi has admitted publicly in the meantime that not only she, but everybody else knew that there were no weapons of mass destruction, that there was no connection to Al-Qaeda, and the whole thing was a blatant lie. Nevertheless, they did this war, which, killed, I don't know how many thousands and thousands of innocent people. And, where was the ICC then? So the ICC is a corrupt institution. That's very, very obvious. And the people who are now going after President Trump, I don't know the exact legal battles Trump is involved in. But, first of all, the US has not signed on to the ICC. Russia has not signed on to it. Many other countries haven't done so. And then for authorities, inside the United States to go after Trump, I think, is reflexive of the same idea that you eliminate any force or any voice who could be a potential opponent to this war machine of the neoliberal system. I think this is a very bad sign, and I think most countries in the world completely reject the authority of the ICC, and I think the majority of the people of the United States reject this prosecution of President Trump as well.
And there are comments from around the world about the ICC case, asking how is it a war crime for President Putin to have orphans and children at risk moved from a war zone into safety in Russia? So there's another aspect to that. Now let's move to the economy quickly. I'm going to try to lump a couple of questions together because we have a number of questions. One is from Salt Lake City, Utah. If the banks aren't bailed out, then what happens to depositors' funds? And a second question on banking is, how likely is an actual run on the banks or a collapse of the dollar? So why don't you see if you can take those two together?
Well, the big danger is, as we have warned again and again, and especially Lyndon LaRouche has warned over the decades repeatedly in the most starkest terms, the danger is that these speculators, the people who are making the profits of the billionaires more profitable, they are gambling with the livelihood of the normal people. I think a very useful lesson is what happened in Germany in 1923, when the Reichsbank had to pay both the war debt from the First World War, but also then the war reparation. And they did that for several years, from 1919 to 23, and nothing was visible. The Reichsbank was printing money. It all seemed fine. But when the French then occupied the Rhineland and production came to a standstill, then within a few months, from basically the summer 23 to November, you had an explosion into a hyperinflation, where in the end people were running with wheelbarrows to the baker to be there at 12 o'clock because the price would then go into a new category of trillions of Reichsmark for a bread. And then eventually it was over because it became absurd. Now that is not exactly what will happen in the West, but we are on that way, because if the banks the central banks are continuously printing money for takeovers, to keep the banks which supposedly are too big to fail, keep bailing them out, keep, at the expense of the production, there could come a point where, you have a hyperinflationary explosion, which will devalue the life savings of people. Everybody who is part of that system is threatened with that phase. But you could also have, and I mentioned that in the call for an international emergency conference, which I issued, you could have a situation where the uncontrolled collapse could be triggered by a whole bunch of mines which could blow up, what Bill Cross from formerly PIMCO had called a supernova, where you have a very shining bright star which all of a sudden evaporates, and that could be a chain reaction like a thermonuclear explosion of the entire financial system. So we are between a rock and a hard place between these two options, hyperinflation or chain reaction collapse, a Schiller and Charybdis, where the only way how you will get out of that is to make an orderly reorganization. You have to, basically make a bankruptcy reorganization. You put the commercial banks under state protection because they are the ones who give credit to the real economy. You have to protect the savings, the pensions, and other categories of, wealth which needs to be saved. And then you have to separate it from the investment banks. And, you have to tell these banks, okay, you have to bring your books in order on your own. You will not get taxpayer bailouts anymore. And if you are bankrupt, then you have to, declare bankruptcy and go out of business. We don't need investment banking. What we need is a system of credit which is given to real production in industry, in agriculture, in transport, in other goods of the common good. And that has to be protected. And that is why you need not only a Glass-Steagall banking separation, but you need a system of national banks, because the power of credit generation has to go back under the control of sovereign governments. Right now it is in the hands of private bankers. The central banks are private banking interests, and they are not devoted to the common good. And ever since the so-called regime change, which was talked about and agreed upon in Jackson Hole 2 years ago, or maybe 3 years by now, whereby the central banks have more power than the governments. And that is a completely upside down relationship. And we have to reinstall the sovereignty of the government to control what is, done with the credit and to what conditions the credit should be issued. So this is coming upon us, if people like it or not. And I think it's quite symptomatic that the discussion about Glass-Steagall has re-erupted. But I think at this point, 15 years after the financial crisis of 2008, a simple Glass-Steagall is not enough. you need to address the problem as a whole, and that is what is in my 10 principles for a new security architecture, which I really urge you to read and endorse and help us to put pressure on institutions so that the more quickly we can have such a conference to reorganize the entire system, the better.
Helga, we're running out of time. I'll give you one more question from Steve from Nova Scotia as a somewhat philosophical question of what you were just talking about. He asks, when will we have an economy that doesn't see money as an end in itself? And he said, instead, we need to plan, he says, 7 generations ahead to ensure a net benefit for those who come after us. You want to have a comment on that?
Yes, I think, money is an idiot. That's what my late husband always used to say. Money it's just a means. It's not a value in itself. And a society in which money is the golden calf around which everybody is dancing, that was already the discussion in the Bible. That is a society which is doomed to go under. So what we have to move away is the idea that money has a value in itself, and that we, measure things in terms of the physical economy, which was developed by Lyndon LaRouche, which is the idea that you have to have a standard to measure creativity, to measure productivity, and the measurement is, does an investment increase the productivity of the economy and therefore leads to an increase of the relative potential population density of an economy. Now that is a measurement which is absolutely provable, it's transparent, and it is also associated with the idea that a continuous increase in that population density is necessary. It's the law of the universe, and it has to do with the fact that naturally at every level of technology, theoretically, you come to a point of exhaustion because either the raw material is becoming scarce or it's becoming too expensive to produce, and then you have to apply a new physical principle based on scientific and technological breakthroughs, and that increases the level of productivity and therefore redefines the entire economy on a new economic platform. Now that has been the reason why humanity came from the Stone Age to presently, 8 billion people. If you would apply all existing technologies, everybody could have a decent life on this planet. But, we are only on the planet Earth, and we have to think about that we are sitting in a very complex universe with probably 2 trillion galaxies at least. And, that in the long term, since we want to have a human species as the immortal species, in other words, in 2 billion years, when our sun is becoming a problem for us on Earth, we do not want to be stuck only on Earth, but we have to really think of how to create conditions for the long-term survivability of our species in the universe. Now, most people don't think this way because politicians want to be re-elected for the next term, so they don't bother about these longer questions. But the scientists and the people who are thinking should be concerned. And if you're thinking that way, then, you're not thinking in terms of money, but you're thinking in terms of how to create the conditions for the human species to do well, the well-being of, mankind. And then money becomes a means of, electronic money or whatever. It's a tool, it's a servant. It should be a device, but it should not be glorified as anything else. But I think some countries who are moving in that direction, between Russia, China, and some other countries of the BRICS, they're moving in the direction of a new currency based on commodities and gold. Gold is a commodity, but other raw materials as well. And that is a step in this direction already. And, I think the paper of my late husband, Trade Without Currency, which I can only advise you to read and study, is probably an influence on these new discussions. And there is hope that mankind will become more reasonable.
Well, Helga, we're out of time. Let me thank you for taking the time and taking these questions. And for all of you who sent in questions, thank you. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but keep them coming. We'll be doing this every week. And in the meantime, let me add that we will be having the next Schiller Institute conference on April 15th, an international conference to take up these questions. So with that, Helga, thanks again, and we'll see you next week.
Yes, pleasure to be with you till next week.